Well, welcome everyone. My name is Dr. Shannon Nash, and I'm the Director of Operations for the North American and Arctic Defense and Security Network. And we're glad to have you join us today for our book roundtable. And we will be looking at Debating Arctic Security, selected writings by Dr. Rob Huebert and Dr. Whitney Lackenbauer. And these selected writings are from 2010 to 2021. And you can find the book at the link that I will now just put in the chat, and it's available on our NADSN website. So our event today will run about an hour and a half, and I'm thrilled to have a full NADSN panel joining us today, which I will turn it over to just momentarily. And if you have any questions during this event, please feel free to drop them into the Q&A function in the webinar, and we'll be happy to address what we can from there as well. I know there'll be lots to discuss today. So I'd like to turn it over to our moderator, and that is Dr. Carrie Roberts. And Dr. Roberts is Associate Professor of Political Science and Chair of the Department of Economics, Justice, and Policy Studies at Mount Royal University in Calgary. And Dr. Roberts' research is primarily concerned with Russian foreign policy towards the West, with a specific emphasis on Russia-US relations and Russia's interest in the Arctic as they relate to Russia's wider foreign policy goals. So she'll be sure to keep Dr. Huebert and Dr. Lackenbauer on their toes discussing those selected writings today. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Roberts.
Thank you, Shannon, and good afternoon, everyone from Calgary. As Shannon mentioned, I'm Carrie. It's my great pleasure to moderate today's discussion on Arctic security, featuring an impressive panel of scholars. Our headliners, Drs. Lackenbauer and Huebert and I were once at the University of Calgary together, what feels like a lifetime ago now. And so I always enjoy these reunions. I've long enjoyed their mostly friendly, I think, disagreements about matters of Arctic security, and I'm delighted to see this long history be recognized and celebrated in this new compilation entitled, as Shannon mentioned, Debating Arctic Security, Selected Writings by Rob Huebert and Whitney Lackenbauer. Anyone who's ever paid any attention at all to Arctic security is likely already familiar with Rob and Whitney, but I'll introduce them nonetheless. Dr. Whitney Lackenbauer is the network lead for NADSN and is the Canada Research Chair in the study of the Canadian North and professor in the School for the Study of Canada at Trent University. Dr. Rob Huebert is a network coordinator for NADSN, and his day job is at the University of Calgary, where he's an associate professor in political science. Both have, of course, written extensively on various subjects relating to Arctic security, history, policy, hence this wonderful book that captures their work and their debates about Northern security. We also have an impressive group of discussants today to help provide for us some context and perspective on matters of Arctic security. We have Heather Exner-Pirot, Suzanne Lalonde, Will Greaves, and Ryan Dean. I'll introduce them individually a little bit later on, but for now, it is my pleasure to turn the floor over to our headliners. Dr. Whitney Lackenbauer and Dr. Rob Huebert. Rob, I believe you have the pleasure of going first this afternoon.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Carrie. It is indeed my privilege to be here to discuss this ongoing series of debates that me and Whitney have had. But I'd also like to point out the important role that many of the individual participants, both in terms of the panel here, as well as many of the audience players, play in ensuring that this very critically important discussion continues, and in fact that it has the most fulsome intellectual and policy understanding, just because obviously all of us agree on the significance of it. Now, you've had a chance, all of you, of course, to follow it over time in terms of our debates, and you have it there in the paper. So I'm not gonna delve with the core of it. But I've got 3 points just within the introductory comments that I want to make. So 3 key points. The first one is the importance of Arctic sovereignty and security. And one of the things that is most rewarding about this long-term debate that me and Whitney have been having is the manner in which it has sparked, both in terms of the academic community, but also the policy community, a greater appreciation and discussion of it. Now, I know a lot of people will not agree with what I've said or what Whitney has said, but people are paying attention. Even before any of the panelists were really looking at any Arctic issues, when I started looking at this, I had a chance to have a discussion with the other person who was doing Arctic things back in the late 1980s, and that was Franklin Griffiths. And we would present at conferences. We'd go to CPSA, we'd go to the various conferences, and without a single word of exaggeration, me and Franklin would outnumber the audience. I don't know how many times I got told the Arctic was a cliche, it was it was a cliche, but it was a niche topic, and why bother paying any attention to it? Everything had been solved. The climate was perfect up there. The term was always pristine environment. Cold War was over. We were never, ever going to turn back to any type of hostilities with the Soviets. It was still Soviets at the time with the Russians. And so you're wasting your time. I literally had people tell me, why on God's earth did you ever pick this as a topic? And so I think that what this debate is able to demonstrate is that there has been a fundamental shift in appreciation for just how important both the twin subjects of sovereignty and security are, and the deepness of the subject matter itself. I mean, the fact of the matter, with just me and Whitney going on and on and on and on with it, is that we're able to basically go into the depths and to really bring forward to, of course, you can't pick up a newspaper today without seeing how important all of this ties together. So that's my first point. The second point is that of mentorship. One of the things I really take away great pleasure from is I look across just at the panel. I look at Ryan, I look at Will, I look at even Carrie. Carrie was a TA of mine. I couldn't quite get her as much into the Arctic as I would have liked to have, but I mean, she was still there. Heather, and of course, I can't forget Whitney. And these are all individuals that one point or another I was able to teach. And the two things that I take the greatest pride on is I look at the work that Will is doing, that Heather is doing, that I know Ryan is going to be doing, and that Whitney has done, and even the important stuff that Carrie, when she, of course, goes on to the Arctic, does have things to say. Now, Suzanne, being a lawyer, you know, what can you ever teach a lawyer? I'm just kidding. I'm married to a lawyer. So, in that particular context, what I'm so thrilled about is they've wanted to continue looking at it. So once again, that's a reaffirmation of this whole debate that me and Whitney have been having just in terms of the significance. The other thing I take great pride on, and it gets to the heart of the debates that me and Whitney have had, is the willingness that each and every one of these have to challenge ideas that I put forward. So in other words, I don't think anyone ever has to worry that Whitney is just going to be replicating what I'm saying, or that Heather is just going to stay in that, or Will on that aspect. And so the fact that we've been able to have this intellectual discourse and discussion about it, in my view, goes beyond just the Arctic issue. It to my mind, that is what university academia in Canada should all be about. Pick the topic that's important from a policy and an intellectual perspective. Be able to grow as a mentorship these young minds that then can challenge you on every and each issue. And this is where I've enjoyed my interaction with Whitney so much on this aspect, when he's not totally pushing me out of the way for travel to Europe or anything like that, because the GAC likes him better. But anyway, but just nevertheless, the fact that we have this expansion, that we have these young scholars that have made such an important name for themselves. And the last point I'll leave on is, of course, the fact of a more fundamental nature, both in terms of mentorship and the subject matter. And, you know, once again, I don't like pulling punches. And let's recognize that within Canada, we're entering into an academic crisis where it's increasingly becoming difficult to have these really, you know, from an intellectual perspective, no holds barred discussions. I mean, I can listen to Will go on, wrongly, of course, in terms of, you know, the focus is on environmental security over hard security. And Heather can correct me all the time in regards when I've missed something in terms of domestic understandings of Canadian our foreign policy. But the point of the matter is we're having those discussions. We're having those issues that we can turn around, and none of us feels that we have to pull punches with each other. And I dare say that what the collection gives us is an appreciation of that very factor that, yeah, Whitney can go on and say, yes, I think the Russians are lovely and cuddly and cute, and I think the Chinese are going to be our best friend. And I can get forward and say, no, I think you're wrong. Likewise, he can, he can remind me when I said something about the creation of an Arctic treaty. It's all down there on paper, and so people can see it. They can see the cut and thrust. But I really think that above and beyond the subject matter itself, the mentorship that the subject has been able to give, that this book also illustrates the very important core element of Canadian academia, and I dare say policy making, in the ability to take the subject and have a no holds given discussion, but at the end of it, where we can all come together as colleagues, and I dare say as good friends. And I'm afraid that this is something that is at risk right now in Canadian universities. And it's something that I hope that the book makes some form of contribution to. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Huebert. I suspect Dr. Lackenbauer is going to want to say something about the cuddly Russians comment, and maybe a few other things. So I will turn the mic over to you, Whitney.
Well, certainly I'll acknowledge I have some Russian friends who are participating in this, who certainly have strong viewpoints on these things and are welcome. But for the most part, I mean, Rob, I echo everything you said, and probably will not ironically take my 5 minutes here in offering comments, because you framed it very much the way I was looking at it. First of all, I start with intense gratitude for the opportunities that you gave me early in my career to really dig in to Arctic issues, encouraging me and so many of us that this was terrain worthy of exploring. And then your generosity of helping to encourage us to participate in those first events. And I really think of a critical moment for me came in around 2008, where I kept emphasizing, I'm trained as a historian. I don't want to dive into these contemporary discussions. And it was, of course, Rob who encouraged me and said, Whitney, enough's enough. Time for you to step up and come. You have lots to say, and you have some insights. And if anything, that bears a certain amount of my personality, where I never think that I quite know enough. And that's the beauty of being an academic. By no means do I consider any of the debates that Rob and I have been having to be well and truly settled, or the discussions I've been having with all of you to be well and truly settled. I think we have a culture within academia as well of premature certainty, that we're conditioned to publish and write as if we know things, even if that knowledge is derived from what we've kind of scraped through newspapers or picking up through secondary sources. We're not encouraging enough the nature of iterative thinking, and that we're actually mutually developing our understanding. So first thing is, yes, I disagree with Rob, but the fact that so much of my career has been dedicated to engaging with ideas with Rob and exchanging ideas is very much a tribute to his willingness to actually have debates, have ongoing discussions. And I think what I celebrate, one of the things I celebrate in this volume, is it's the notion of a sustained interaction and debate, not something where we've necessarily just recycled the same debate over and over. I was really refreshed working with Rob to pull this book together, to look at how the debate has morphed and changed and evolved, and the influences of certainly everybody on this panel in shaping that, whether it's Kerry's thinking on how Canada relates to Russia, or Will's work on broadening and deepening definitions of security, Ryan encouraging me to rethink securitization, Heather getting me to think about security and its many different facets and think about economic implications of it, certainly Suzanne and teaching me more than I ever thought I would know about international law and those dynamics, and Troy Bouffard encouraging me to think deeper in terms of looking on the literature on Russia and how we think about one another and actually construct one another in the space. But what I want to do for a couple of minutes here is just think about what I've observed as having changed over the last 10 years of discussion. First, I think the binary of cooperation conflict, the old primordial debate, I think is long over. I think we're now all increasingly aware of the implications of being in competitive global space. That certainly I was never considered myself to be a proponent of Arctic exceptionalism. In fact, many of the debates I had with Rob in the early days, I thought was me arguing against Arctic exceptionalism he was espousing in a different way than the liberal internationalists were. But that the region, in fact, is always going to be subject to a lot of the dynamics and metrics through which we seek to understand international interactions. So in essence, I see a greater embracing of the normalization of the Arctic, that it's competitive space, which doesn't mean it's inherently impossible to have cooperation, certainly collaboration, nor does it inherently mean that we're going to have outright conflict. But how we characterize that competition and how we see it unfolding, I think, is a subject of very genuine and substantive debate between Rob and amongst many of us here. I see a real move away from the thinning ice arguments that were the subject of, I think, some of the primordial writings of Rob and Franklin Griffiths, and then Andrea Chiron and others joining in the 2000s, and how that's really moved now towards issues of spillover, or how the Arctic is inextricably linked to or imbricated in global discussions. And we certainly see the expressions of that from the now commander of NORAD, North American Aerospace Defense Command, suggesting that our ways of thinking about Arctic security cannot be extricated from the way we're thinking about security writ large. I also think within these discussions, some of the persistent aspects that certainly between Rob and I, it's a very state-centric debate. So in essence, from that standpoint, it's quite a shallow debate in that the way we're looking at international relations and the way we're focusing is very much on that level. And I think about the work that I've done on the Canadian Rangers, for example, that's not sort of reflected in this particular collection or exchange as being sort of a side point, I think, in my way of compensating what I see as an Arctic security debate that's very much been privileging the Canadian state and state-based interactions. And we'll welcome discussions about that in the conversation today. But really want to emphasize, what Rob has said. We sometimes joke that we're frenemies. I kind of look at you, Rob, kind of like an older brother who's humored me along and cajoles me and prodded me along in many ways, but first and foremost, we remain friends. And what you don't see in a book like this or in the public debates that Rob and I do is how frequently we were on the phone with one another just testing out ideas and finding that we may disagree when we come time to sort of forming the ideas and presenting them in public. But in terms of agreeing on the nature of the questions we're asking, I just want to thank you, Rob, for how much that's been reassuring for me throughout my career to date in sustaining my engagement and encouraging me to keep going. And I share that with so many of you, not only on the panel, but also in the audience, whether it's on Students on Ice with you, Andrew Brezhnev, and some of our debates, after hours, or Ernie Regier, who taught me, back in my undergraduate, what the nature of these discussions looked like. And as we find ourselves in this era of resurgent great power competition, I find myself often going back to things, Ernie, that you showcased for me in the context of earlier periods of NORAD modernization in the 1980s. And then also many of you others, at Arctic Security Working Group discussions and that. Last thing here, I think I'll share is sort of revisiting a lot of these articles in these discussions is also thought about me reevaluating and what things would I go back and change in some of the things that I've written, or what are the assumptions now that I feel a little naive on. I've come away, I think, feeling, hopefully not in a self-justificatory sort of way, but that a lot of my thinking has certainly matured, and I think I've clarified my thinking. Not a ton has fundamentally changed. And I think that's where I really welcome today's discussion and almost encouraging of a discussion of where things maybe should be going. I think the one thing I will say is, in the last 3 to 4 years, the way I conceptualize China as an Arctic actor has certainly changed. And I think that, in essence, there's been some reevaluations that we might talk about today as a group in conceptualizing that. But that in essence, I'm surprised that my thinking with respect to Russia has not fundamentally changed the way I might expect it to have, given that we find ourselves in this competitive space. And that from that standpoint, I think this exercise has been a wonderful opportunity for me to reflect back and rather than simply digging in my heels and defending some of the arguments I've had, really encouraged me to think about where things have changed and where this debate has gone. So really welcome the opportunity. I feel so honored and privileged to have all of you joining on the panel and all of you joining in this broader discussion in the audience as well, and really welcome your reflections.
Thanks very much, Whitney. Well, we're off to a great start. I'll put Dr. Huebert on notice for the fact that I can't wait to ask him later what things he's been wrong about over the past 10 years or so when it comes to Arctic security. But we'll get to that. It's now a time to introduce our discussants, our panelists for today. So I will do that fairly quickly and then turn the mic back over. I think we'll go probably in the order that I will introduce them, unless there's any resistance to that. First, we have Dr. Heather Exner-Pierrot, who is a NADSEN network coordinator and is senior policy analyst at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute and global fellow at the Wilson Center Polar Institute. We also have with us today Dr. Suzanne Lalonde, also a network coordinator with NADSEN, professor of international law at Université de Montréal, and is a specialist on the law of the sea with an emphasis on the Arctic. Dr. Will Graves is a network coordinator for NADSEN as well, is an assistant professor of international relations at the University of Victoria, where he specializes in Arctic security and environmental politics with an emphasis on climate change, energy, and Indigenous peoples. And finally, we have Ryan Dean, who is a policy and research coordinator for NADSEN, a PhD candidate in the Department of Political Science at the University of Calgary, and where his research focuses on Canadian Arctic policy, sovereignty, defense, and governance. So with those introductions, I think I will turn the microphone over to you, Heather, if you are okay with going first, and we will go from there.
Well, sure. I think we're all going to compete to try to ask Rob what he thinks he got wrong in the last 20 years. So we'll all ask him that and eagerly await his answer. And I have to say, I think it's brave of both Whitney and Rob to go ahead and put their life's work of the last 2 decades and allow us to do a retrospect and a critique of it. Because, you know, who amongst us hasn't changed? If you hadn't changed your mind in 20 years with all the events, there'd be something wrong with you there too. And thanks also for all the nice words. So I guess where I would come from, you know, what would I want us to discuss? What do I want to know from these gentlemen and from my other colleagues? You know, I think if we look back 20 years, and I think that's what we're doing, you know, going back to the you know, beginning of Whitney's career and Rob, and when there starts to be more interest in Arctic security, we had a lot of worst case scenarios. You know, there was a lot of discussion on what the worst case scenario would be. And now 20 years later, fast forward, none of that has transpired. So now do we ask ourselves, is it just delayed? Is it deferred? Are we going to say for the next 2 decades that it's just on the cusp? Or do we say maybe there are some dynamics here that, you know, won't allow, you know, didn't allow for it, and we should try to pursue those. So in the conflict or cooperation, and you said competition, Whitney, that's another aspect. Has there been competition? And I think, you know, back when I started 2005 and going, you know, in the commodities boom, we said that there was a race for resources. We said that the Arctic would be more accessible. That hasn't really happened. It isn't really more accessible. There isn't a race for resources. There isn't an Arctic boom. It's an expensive place to operate. The rest of the GDP of the Arctic countries is growing faster than the Arctic portions of those countries. So there was no Arctic boom. So some of our underlying assumptions were in fact incorrect. And do we think that that will change in the next 10 or 20 years? Do we think there will be more accessibility? Do we think there will be a race? Or is there no reason to have competition? Here you have, you know, 8 countries, certainly 5 coastal states that have more territory than they know what to do with, and certainly don't need to take it from other places. So that's where I would start. Things are much different. I think we're, you know, were we naive, like Whitney said? Things have just changed, but we know a lot more. We know that the fundamentals of what would have been a security kind of a conflictual kind of environment has changed. And the broader scope, I agree with what you guys have said. We moved from, you know, kind of that Arctic specific thinning ice thesis to spillover, you know, that there's geopolitics at play and there's Russia and China at play, and the Arctic is a domain in the larger environment. And that's why it's important, not because it's the Arctic, not because there's something unique to the Arctic, but because it exists on this globe. So that's where I would start, and I'll pass it over to Carrie to the others.
Thanks very much, Heather. Wonderful. And just before I turn it over to Suzanne, I realized that I neglected to mention at the top of our session that, of course, audience members are welcome also to gang up on Rob Huebert and ask him difficult questions throughout the course of today. No, and seriously, any questions at all, we'll be using the Q&A feature. So please feel free, our audience members to share some questions with us or some ideas for things you'd like to hear the panelists discuss as we go, please. Okay, sorry. So Suzanne, can I turn the microphone over to you?
Yes, thank you. Thank you to you all. I wanted just to pick up on a few things. One of the things, you know, Rob, of course, had to make the lawyer's joke, you know, it's, you can't resist. And in a group like this, I have to say that I've always felt like how lucky I was to be able to participate. when you teach public international law to undergraduates, it's, I think, week one that you say, you know, these legal rules, these legal concepts will take us so far and we're going to hit a wall and we're unable to go further or understand, or we lack the tools. So we're in this little box, this little legal box. And I think what Whitney was saying is the comfort is to stay in your little, well, that's what the rules say. Oh, what do you mean they're not being respected? Or what might happen? How might they be? Well, that's not my. So how much richer these past years have been to be able to discuss and participate in dialogue with, you know, historians, political scientists, security experts, because this is outside my realm, but it helps understand. And I think too, if I could say about my two colleagues over the 20 years, how inspiring their conviction is. Now, I don't mean that as dogmatic and refusing to be open to, but if I could just seize on Rob, I was at a meeting at one point where the Q&A was very harsh on Dr. Huebert, and he takes it in stride and concedes points when there has to be conceded, but, you know, also the strength and conviction of the message he was trying to convey. And I found that very inspiring, and Whitney as well. But I think, as they both said, it's born of respect and an openness. But I do find that their conviction is just so inspiring. About maybe more the substance, I found it was interesting how Rob again was lumping sovereignty and security all the time. And one of the things that I found interesting as we've journeyed, I've been on this journey, all the group and many of the participants, you know, the community of Arctic interested people, was that people like Will Greaves, Heather, everyone, we've seen security broaden out in its interpretation and being called on to think about it in a larger. I think that's happening with sovereignty as well. Whitney mentioned state-centric, and you know, it's classically in a state-to-state concept, but I think that's happening a little bit as well, as we see maybe some of the Canada's Indigenous peoples claiming a right, and you know, the sovereignty includes them. And so I've been fascinated by this broadening, and it seems to be percolating into some international legal thinking that maybe sovereignty has a cultural connotation. Anyways, I find that absolutely fascinating. And I would say that international law has shifted in the last 20 years. The last thing I would pick up on Heather's point about worst case scenarios, where I've had to have conviction is, while being reasonable and not alarmist, like the Rob Huebert school of thoughts, but I always felt that if there was any sovereignty question, maybe some slight risk, it was maritime sovereignty, Canada's maritime sovereignty. And I have to confess to, you know, maybe publishing an article I'd like to yank back. But anyway, so the rusted out Panamanian tanker coming through the Northwest Passage with some random crew hasn't happened, as Heather has pointed out. But I think there are more ships and there's more interest. And I just think it's just encouraging Canada to get its governance regime and its partnerships in place and to be ready. So I would just say, whereas it's not an alarmist scenario, you know, the fact that, you know, China's interested in sending the Shui Long through. And I think it just, for me, there's a development that bears watching, and just encourage us all to keep thinking and to make sure that our governance regime is inclusive and effective. So anyways, I'll stop there, and I'll thank, you know, again, that, you know, having a lawyer on sufferance is just, but it's been fantastic. It's quite the ride, and I hope we have a lot more debates in us.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. That's a great, I'm jotting down ideas as I go for possible things we can discuss. Maybe we can ask the panelists later to speak about this evolving understanding of sovereignty. Wonderful. So now I will turn the mic over to Will Greaves at the University of Victoria.
Yes, hello everybody, and what a pleasure to be here today. Hello from Victoria, BC. And I'd just like to reiterate what's been said, because for anybody in the audience who is perhaps a little less familiar with this group, it really is such a pleasure to have the whole team here, and to have these people who, speaking personally, have played such an important role in mentoring me in my career and in absolutely getting me started, getting me launched in this entire field of Arctic social science. I'm one of the many University of Calgary alumni represented on this panel. U of C is known often for the other Calgary school, but I think it's worth noting the real strength in Arctic scholarship and Arctic security represented in this panel. But it is extraordinary, and it's to the credit of the university and to the credit of people like Professor Huebert and Professor Lackenbauer, who played such important roles for generations in academic terms of subsequent Arctic scholars. And so we are indebted to both of you. And it's a pleasure to be here to talk about that. Rob has made a couple of comments already, which I feel were targeted more or less in my direction, pertaining to the focus that I've had in a lot of my work on climate change and environmental issues in the North. And this is a subject of considerable good-natured ribbing between Rob and I. But I think when Rob makes this point, he's actually not giving himself enough credit, because something that I would like to call attention to is that Rob was ahead of his time in terms of discussing climate change in relation to Arctic security and sovereignty issues. And it was a real pleasure when I was first sent this book and I was reviewing it in anticipation of this panel to see that the very first article, which is included, is in fact Rob's early article on climate change in the Northwest Passage. And so I think that's an underappreciated aspect of the I don't know what the adjective is, Hubertian approach to Canadian Arctic security studies. And so in the spirit of kind of questioning our two experts here, I'd love to hear their reflections on the climate change question, because it occurs to me that in the same 20 years that is covered by this collection of their collected writings, we've also seen such a steady drumbeat of climate change in terms of our understanding and the production of scientific knowledge of the impacts of climate change globally, of course, but in the Arctic as well. And so 2001 and 2007 and 2014 and 2021, these IPCC reports and various other climate science reports focusing on the Arctic provide the backdrop for all of this work that we do. And given the depth of expertise that you both bring, I'd love to hear your reflections on where you are now in terms of the climate crisis and its implications for the region, and perhaps where you started in your own intellectual journeys, and recognizing that while many, I think, of the points that Rob has made in his career about conventional security challenges and great power competition and so on, took time to ripen in some of our eyes or some of our minds, but actually, in fact, have emerged as quite serious and quite perhaps pressing issues when they might not have seemed to be a few years ago. Climate change, perhaps even more so, the butt of good-natured jokes, but is something that Professor Huebert was ahead of his time on. Professor Lackenbauer, of course, is featured in his work as well, and which is something that I feel we need to all pay attention to and discuss more rather than less. So I would love to hear your reflections on all that, and just generally, what a pleasure to be here. Thanks to you both.
Thanks very much, Will. And our final panelist for today, I'll turn things over to you, Ryan Dean over at the University of Calgary.
Hello all. It's an honor and a privilege to be asked to be part of this panel. I'm definitely the junior member here. When I reviewed the book, the authors asked at the start, what is Arctic security? But it drew my mind to what I saw as tensions running throughout the volume rooted in Arctic sovereignty more than security. And I can attribute this to Rob, because we're all picking on Rob, who has written that the distinctions between the concepts of sovereignty and security are to him, to a large degree, false. And I read your debate as sort of being a proxy for D&D and global affairs, Rob representing the Department of National Defense with sovereignty rooted in notions of control through military force coming out of Clark's ad hoc 1985 policy, while Whitney always seems to back the more legal notions of sovereignty put forward by global affairs, particularly the writings of Eric Vong from the 1970s. However, Whitney also seems to pick up that torch left by Franklin Griffiths and others surrounding the role of Northerners in sovereignty, and perhaps we can get to that in the discussion. Anyways, it drew my mind to tensions running throughout the volume, and with Rob, these tensions are explicit. I always found that it's funny that he has the same working assumption that D&D did, but his writings rarely line up with D&D policy, or at least the way it was implemented over the years. Whitney, on the other hand, he does seem to line up with GAC and his larger writings on whole of government, the Canadian Arctic. Maybe this is their different disciplines and theoretical backgrounds. I always found it funny that Whit could look at Rob and say from a historical perspective that Rob's writings are somewhat ahistorical. He's always writing out of context. For example, Rob wrote in 2019, "A new Cold War in the Arctic. The old one never ended." Says nothing has changed, but in the same year, he turns around an article called "The New Arctic Strategic Triangle Environment." It's new and exciting. It's got a triangle. And there's this implicit tension, on the other hand, running through Whitney's writings that I really found in this volume. He's got that GAC sovereignty definition, and he's got that Griffiths definition, and you can see it when he's writing about Canadians writ large, his GAC definition, and then flips over to referencing Northerners and Southerners, his Griffiths definition. So that's another tension I found that I hope we could talk about. Rob could say from his international relations perspective to Whit, historians are inherently constructivists, which is about identity. When are we Canadians or Northerners or Southerners? Is it all dependent upon context, or could you make more substantive knowledge claims? And I never really found an answer to those tensions in this writing. It just sort of persists through the volume. I thought we were making some progress in the debate when they co-authored Premier Partners, which is a very rare thing for them to do. It seemed like Rob agreed with Whitney that US sovereignty is a boon to, or the US is a boon to Canadian sovereignty, but then in the next article, it's like it never happened. Anyways, I just, wanted to amplify what Professor Lalonde said and just direct the attention towards that sovereignty security tension that I found there. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Ryan. Wonderful. Okay, so that's the opening round. So I'm wondering if, now there were a few questions that were posed to Rob and to Whitney from our panelists. I'm wondering if that makes sense, not seeing questions. Oh, there's one now in the Q&A, but I wonder if we start there. So there were a couple of good things that came out of that. Of course, Suzanne's mention of the evolving nature of sovereignty, and maybe an interest in sort of considering how that has changed and why that's changed matters so much. And Will has put an important question to Rob and to Whitney as well about reflecting on the climate change question. What has changed as far as how we consider the impact of climate change in the Arctic, say, over the past 10 years. Maybe that's a good place to start. But I also want to give Whitney and Rob, I want to give you an opportunity to respond to other things that might have come from the panel. So do we have, Whitney would like to go first? Off you go.
Well, thanks to all of you for such thoughtful, generous comments. And thanks, Carrie, for coordinating all of this. Yeah, no, but really wonderful reflections from each of you. And I want to spend just a few brief seconds here reflecting on all of them. Heather, I think great, testing of or encouraging us to think about those worst case scenarios. And that thinking, and part of what I've gone back and reflected on with that is, it's maybe that coming out of those scenarios, we weren't just treating them as possibilities or imagined potentialities. They got scripted or narrated as if we were predicting things that I think if we look at them as predictions, the predictions did not come true. Our assumptions did not hold. So from that standpoint, what I think I've really tried to do in my own thinking over the last 5 or 6 years is get away from this predicting notion, because we're not really talking about probabilities or margins of error. We're not doing that kind of methodical work that in my mind would be involved in predictive modeling. We're doing foresight. And what I'm learning now from foresight assessment analytics is you're just imagining possibilities. And I think if we could go back and even frame some of my writings in the 2000s, my do-over would be just soften the things that I was saying needed to be done, sort of or predicting that things would happen with often vague timeframes, and instead explore. We just heard an ambassador speak, or pardon me, the commander of the Danish Arctic Command in an Arctic e-talk section just before this activity, and I'm only ever as good as the last thing I read or the last person I heard speak, is they said it's the what if questions that really drive them. And I keep thinking that's where I want us to go back now, is thinking about what ifs. We need to think in terms of worst case scenarios, at least to contemplate those absolute possibilities, but let's not wrongly assume them to be probabilities or think that those are likelihoods that we need to be necessarily going all in as formal operating assumptions. Suzanne, I love your parsing of sovereignty and security, and the fact that, I think that's been something I've been working through over the last 15 years in a very deliberate manner. And I owe a lot to you, of course, and Rob, in encouraging me to be more explicit about what my definitions are that I'm bringing to bear, or what I see as sovereignty and security being very different, requiring very different sets of actions. And that often when we lump together the two and think that sovereignty is enhanced or bolstered by, say, military activities, security actions, we're actually undermining the certainty and strength that we should be projecting. And Rob will say this is just me being a soapbox for guy. It's not the case. It's actually something I came to terms with looking at the historical arc since the Second World War of Canada has come to deeply sediment its legal positions. So we're not just making claims. That language even thinks like we're throwing them out there. We've built these methodically, and they're actually not inherently improved, certainly not in a legal sense, by some of the actions that Rob's calling for. I'd say I support the actions that Rob's calling for, as many of you have probably noticed in the reading, just on a very different set of basis, pretext. It's not for sovereignty reasons that we need to do these things. It's for security reasons. So our analytics need to look at what is the nature of that security environment, and then which sector of security. That's my bridge over to Will. And certainly Will and Ryan, both of you, we've worked through these things at length over the years and continue to work through them. And Will, I agree with you that Rob was ahead of his time. The writings that got me to jump into this field in the late 1990s were Rob's, I think, very holistic, broad and deepening, but mostly broadening definitions of security. And what I mean by that for the audience who don't know, meaning security is not just the military sector. We're not just doing strategic studies in a very circumscribed sense, but in essence, security is changing. And Rob was narrating out, it involves environmental dimensions. It involves political dimensions. In a Canadian sense, we'd call that sovereignty, I think. And Ryan, we worked through a lot of those thoughts together, and economic and so on. I think the casualty of the cooperation conflict narrative becoming so sedimented and so fixed around 2003, 2004 between Rob and Franklin Griffiths was that it encouraged you, Rob, to double down. And Ryan, you're going to see your own thinking on this, so I'm not trying to appropriate it. But a doubling down on that military sector for you to establish that we can't forget about that sector, which I'd agree with. But in essence, you meant that overwhelmed the other sectors, and it set it up like it was a zero-sum game across these sectors, which to me was a dramatic departure from what you were suggesting in the late 90s, which suggested it's all about balancing. And it was Ryan who tipped me off to thinking, actually, that's what I've been trying to do for the last 15 years, is trying to build a justification, actually, that's not about peace versus Dobbs versus Hawks, pardon me, or conflict versus, it's trying to say we actually need whole of government, whole of society, broad-based, multi-sectoral, balanced, calibrated approaches to security. And then Ryan, coming across to your comments, I think you pointed out a really, I think partly that alignment between D&D and GAC. And I'd actually say in many respects, my writings on security probably align more closely to D&D thinking, not across the board. We have some members of the audience here who might have different takes than certainly me. But in terms of the emphasis on whole of government and what sectors of security are really in play that are predisposed toward leading to conflict. And I think that's a very important way of dealing with some of the questions that also are dilemmas that Will brought up. When we're talking environmental security in the Arctic, what are we talking about? Which definition of environmental security? And Petra Delata at various events has encouraged us to be more precise in which notion of environmental security. If we're talking about the resource scarcity, violence, climate change in the Arctic as being a catalyst or a stimulant or a generator of conflict, military conflict in the Arctic, I say that's one that I have never been a proponent of and remain even now less convinced that that's the primary driver. If anything, the competition and in the military sector in the Arctic is driven, and Ryan, this is also our thinking together, is driven much more by the technology change going on and grand strategic drivers than it is anything relating to climate change. But if we move outside of the military sector or political sector into the other sectors of security, economic security, environmental security, and especially societal security, it's absolutely the central variable that I think when we rescope the conversation to be more deliberate in what sector we're speaking to, I think our writings dramatically downplay the centrality of climate and environmental change as being the major development or reshuffling, reorientation, prioritizing, whatever that's gone on in the last 2 decades. And I don't think that's incompatible with what Heather has said about our economic futures and imagined boom going on in the Arctic having not occurred anywhere near the pace or magnitude that people have predicted. And that in some ways, I think we need to go back, and my final comment here is, getting back to constantly testing our assumptions, not getting too comfortable. One of the things that I think I have been so fortunate to have had in my career is to be placed in situations where, especially with Rob, but actually with all of you, I feel uncomfortable or uncertain in terms of my ideas. And that's not a bad thing. We sometimes in academia these days conflate unsafe and uncomfortable. My point is we don't want to ever be in an unsafe scenario. I never feel unsafe with Rob asking me tough questions. But certainly he makes me feel intellectually uncomfortable because he's constantly probing and testing my assumption and how well they hold. And I think that has made me a better scholar. And I think it's also helped to enrich this debate going forward. And I hope we can also embrace that spirit too of putting one another on the proverbial academic hot seat is a great privilege. Both being able to ask those questions, but also to get to sit on that hot seat and have brilliant minds around you test whether or not your ideas hold. And to me, that's, Suzanne, to play on your word, it's the greatest sign of respect is to actually take somebody else's ideas seriously enough to challenge them. The greatest sign of disrespect is to ignore them or turn your head the other way and pretend like they don't exist.
Wow, that's a great point, Whitney. I'm gonna process that one. Wonderful. Okay, so Rob, a number of questions have been lobbed in your direction. I won't mention the one that I want you to answer first, about all the things you've been wrong about, or maybe just that one thing. But off you go. I'll turn the mic over to you.
Well, one of the things, of course, that is just I reflect on, first of all, thank you very much for all the reflections, questions, issues. I mean, this is what makes the subject so fascinating for me. The fact that each and every one of you, I'm thinking, oh, thank God that this is being recorded, because I'm going to go back and this is going to be informing a lot of my ongoing writing now, because there are such brilliant ideas coming out of this and critiques. And I love it. I mean, I think back to Suzanne's comment about that. You're talking about the time we were in Denmark, aren't you, Susan? And that guy basically said, geopolitics was bullshit. Why are you wasting our time? Blah, blah, blah. But the thing that I like about that, okay, I remember that too. And I mean, once again, as Whitney just said, if someone engages with you, it's always been my viewpoint that that's so much better than being ignored. But someone like Suzanne remembers that and was there, and it was afterwards. And to me, once again, this is something we lose in Canadian academia. We often forget that, okay, so sure, fine, that guy thought he knew what he's talking about. He didn't. He was wrong, as we all know from what's happening in Ukraine now. But anyway, the joy of it is that afterwards, me and Suzanne, and I'm trying to remember if you were there, Whitney, or not on that one. You may have not been at that one yet. But me, Suzanne, a couple of our other, I can't remember if David was there, but anyway, so there was enough of a group of us. We could still go off, have a beer, talk about the ideas. Was this guy right? Rob, are you wrong? But hey, we're here for you. In other words, that sense of the intellectual community that goes beyond just simply the thing. I mean, I must confess, I enjoyed that, because once again, I'd rather have someone pay attention to my ideas than ignore me. And I'm hoping that I've passed that on to each and every one of you in terms of my own teaching. So, once again, thanks for reminding me, Suzanne. Terry, you asked in terms of where I got wrong. Well, one of the things that I got wrong was where I not lost interest, but I got focused on other stuff. And I think back of some of my writings in terms of the early days on the permanent participants within the Arctic Council. And I do have a little bit of regret that in terms that I did not follow the governance, and particularly and Heather reminds me on every time she makes one of her brilliant comments on the role of the Indigenous Northerners within the overall policy makings. I do regret that I didn't keep on that like I did with the military and the overall international governance, because I mean, back in those days, once again, when the permanent participants were being elevated into something more meaningful than observers in the format of the governance system, going from the AAPS to the Arctic Council. And I did start writing on that. And I did know the individuals that were like Terry Fenge and others that were directly integrated into the process. And I was wrong to let that go. I reflect upon that, and I wish that when I started writing about that, that I had kept that going, that I'd kept that as sort of, it wasn't never going to be a major focus, because my major focus has always been on a much more traditional view of security. But I do regret letting go of that instead of following through on that context. And in terms of wrong, you know, I look back on some of the writings I did in some of the early phases in terms of some of the international governance movements. So I remember, and Whitney reminds me all the time, writing about saying, hey, maybe we need an international treaty. But once again, I think back in terms of that, and, you know, it's a reflection of the intellectual community. For me, the community that was influencing it was Suzanne's community. It was the international lawyers. I was taught by one of the leading experts on law of the sea, Elizabeth Mann-Borghese. And so right away, I can remember how my mindset went into that. It's sort of like, well, of course, you know, law of sea works for maritime security. Wouldn't a law of the Arctic then work for the Arctic? And now I think back to some of that and I think, okay, I think I've got some of that mistaken. The other thing, and I mean, this follows from a point that Ryan and Will bring forward, and I want to respond to it, and that's, and also Heather. And this is the expansion conceptualization of sovereignty. And once again, this is one of these things, a reflection upon, you know, when we're putting the book together, really caused me to sit back down and think about it, because, you know, all of them participated in my strategic studies class, where we have one section where we talk about securitization. This is a theory of expansion and deepening, mainly comes from a sort of a European school of thought. And I mean, Will has taken and done such beautiful work on it. And I you know, all kidding aside, Will, the stuff you've done with Weaver and Ole, and I see that in Heather's work, and I'm seeing that in Ryan's work. And what this is it's actually at the fundamental nature, it's a conceptualization that I'm not even sure that I was that good on when I'd say, okay, folks, we got to read about this. This is an important part. And I was always offering it as sort of a counterpoint to the realist, because strategic study, it's the realist, it's the neo-realist, might is right, and people are horrible and we're all going to die. So it was sort of like, okay, well, what about if we add a social context? And I reflect upon in terms of my thinking. And it's sort of like, is it a regret? Do I think I got it wrong? Or do I think that, man, here's where the teachers are teaching the teacher? Because in this particular context, what the works of Will, Heather, Ryan are all doing to me is that it's sort of like, I got to go back and I really got to think about the securitization. And so did I get it wrong? Yeah, I got it wrong because, I mean, from a theoretical perspective, from an ontological perspective, I'm not sure if I was ready to utilize it. But then we get into this issue that Heather raises about sovereignty. How can you not think about sovereignty without thinking about it in the same wavelength as a social construct, rather than just as a hardcore? I mean, political scientists love their definition of sovereignty. It's got to have people, borders, a governance system, and it has to be accepted by everyone else around you, you know, sovereignty 101. But then you start thinking about, okay, a societal sovereignty. And once again, goes to the heart of Heather's and Will's work. And so I'd say in the context, it's an educational part. You know, did I get it wrong? Well, I wasn't thinking about it in that way, but they very much brought me into thinking about it in that particular element. And I think that this is really important because it underlines the fact that not only are we talking about policy and events within the context of the Arctic, but it underlines that the Arctic formulates one of the best case studies that I can think of in terms of being able to take the whole theorizing, I mean, let's face it, when we talk about what Heather and Will are doing in societal sovereignty, We are talking not only on ontological debates, not only theoretical, but it gets to epistemological level differences. And I think that the joy here is we can have Whitney as a historian, we can have Susan as a lawyer, Will and Heather as political scientists, and Carrie as political scientists, and we can include others that are in the group. And all of a sudden, from this discourse, this dialogue, we actually get it. It's sort of like, okay, there's different ways of understanding it, but it brings home and it drills to me how the functioning of sovereignty and security works. In other words, it's a learning process that teaches me that, okay, well, sovereignty is not this 4-point black and white that the 101 political science text teaches. And so there is a little bit on that. One other thing that I've gotten wrong, and I'm trying now to make amends to it. And I mean, this goes right to Carrie's point, and I think is a brilliant point. But what I've gotten wrong, once again, as a senior person within this group, I did not do a very good job of being able to integrate the Arctic understanding, both in terms of international relations, both in terms of disciplinary studies, into the broader political science Canadian debates. The one thing I have a huge regret is that when I read stuff coming out from colleagues that I respect on the Canadian foreign policy, the Dave Blacks, the Heather Smiths, and they're talking about the flows and ebbs of Canadian foreign policy, the Brian Bowes, the Arctic gets left out. And I think that it has been a major mistake on my part not to engage that community, to make sure that, when there was a call out from International Journal or Canadian Foreign Policy of saying, hey, how do we understand the aspects of Canadian foreign policy? Andrea Sharon, to her credit, has attempted to integrate on that. But I mean, for my own purposes, I wish that I had done a better job of that. I don't think that the broader political science community within Canada understands and appreciates the type of thinking, the capability that is represented in this particular context. The other question was, of course, that Will asked me about is on climate change. Now, this is both the strength and the weakness of what we have done here, what we have put together. The strength is that immediately when I started thinking about the Arctic and the possibilities of climate change, and the credit goes out to Gordon McBean, who said, Rob, why don't you think about what climate makes way back before it even was a trendy topic. And so I remember talking, and then once I talked to Gordon, then he puts me in touch with these two probably two of the best intellectual entrepreneurs in Canada. And that's, of course, Louis Fortier, supported very much by his, and it was a supporting role, and he knew it, Dave Barber. But I mean, here's these individuals, and Louis represents, project making par excellent, but he's on the sciences side, on the science side. But man, oh man, if I have ever learned anything about organization, it's from Louis. And so, once again, the good news is, yeah, I'm going to pay attention to what Barbara is saying. I'm going to pay attention to what Louis is telling me. I'm going to go to the conferences that they're nice enough to invite me to. And I'm going to be there when ArcticNet is being formulated and all the rest. Did I necessarily understand everything of the sciences that were being told to me? No, and that's where it gets right to Will's point, because was I coming up too quickly in terms of saying, okay, we're going to have a melting Arctic, we're going to have open shipping routes right away, and I think that that's where I got it wrong, is without understanding the nuances of the sciences that it was required. But on the other hand, I like the fact that they brought me in and said, hey, Rob, they never criticized. It was never sort of like you're getting it wrong, but you're listening to us, and see how it goes. I think I'm a little bit early. I think about for example, most people aren't aware, but we had a potentially problem with a New Zealand yachtsman that went through the Northwest Passage. He was told not to. And I think that that's the forecoast. I also think, and it gets back to the point that, oh God, you can tell old timers here, in terms of the whole issue of what is being missed in this particular context. I think it may have been Will that had raised the issue, but the extreme examples. Well, I think part of the thing is that when we're always constantly talking about when extremes happen, sometimes we take it as just sort of the new normal. And I think of the fact when I started writing on this fact, if I was going to, like Suzanne's talking about, oh, well, there wasn't a rusty, a rusty freighter going through. But my God, in 2016 and 17, we had a cruise vessel that was larger than any single surface combatant in World War II. The Crystal Serenity, that was 2,000 tons heavier than the Yamato, sails through the Northwest Passage. And Adam Lajeunesse will tell you that, hey, we had to go looking for ice because Adam got to go on and being an expert on board the ship. And I mean, that is a new normal. I could imagine, if Susan, instead of saying about a leaky librarian, said this huge cruise liner, bigger than anything they had in World War II, is going to go through the Northwest Passage. And then she could sit back and say, instead of saying, well, I got that wrong. No, she didn't get it wrong, but we accept it. And so that's a joy partly of it. I'll end on this point. The one thing I want to take from all this discussion is I want to be able to situate what each and every one of us has done and try, and this is Whitney's influence on me as his historian, take it and overlay it backwards. One of the things I don't think that we ever do is say, okay, where were the analyses that we have? And let's try to uncover by looking at what has happened so we aren't confusing the new normal with what we thought was going to be a huge game changer, because I think the Crystal Serenity going through is a game changer. We just don't see it. So it's a question of, okay, well, where were the variables? What variables that Whitney has uncovered, that Suzanne has uncovered, that Carrie has uncovered, Heather, and how do we then stream it forward to see where in fact it was fitting for going? We don't do, I know definitely within political science, we don't like going backwards on that. But I think once again, Whitney forces me to think in that context.
All right, thank you very much to you both for those comments. Rob, to your point about needing to integrate the Arctic more into Canadian foreign policy and our broader study and understanding of it, I will take the opportunity to point out that there is a chapter on the Arctic in the most recent edition of Canada Among Nations. It ain't bad. And from there, I would like to just ask some of our other panelists, Heather, Suzanne, Ryan, Will, if there's anything in what Rob and Whitney commented on that you would like to mention. Suzanne, you might have something that you wanted to say, I think.
Well, yeah, I just threw into the chat how I had I had been meaning to thank Whitney as well. Rob is, the doyen, the dean of these questions, and Whitney has been the force of nature, the energy that has pulled together so many projects that so many of us have benefited from, so many incredible opportunities, and that's in being one of the most brilliant examples on point. No, very short, just to say, I had a co-author about the Liberian tanker. It was his language, not mine, but my name is on that article. But yeah, I'm not going to take any more time. Thank you so much. Oh, and I think the point about the Rob and that fateful night of his discussion is, I would have been in the corner somewhere in the fetus position rather than having drinks at the bar and saying, hey, I got attention. And it's a joy and it's funny to think about, but I don't know, I just found it quite an illuminating experience, the way he handled it and the way as academics we have to respond. And I take Whitney's point, I don't like being in the hot seat ever. So I've written down being in the hot seat is a privilege, underlined, and I'll work on that. And so I thank my colleagues for their leadership on these kind of situations.
Thank you, Suzanne. Oh, sorry, I just saw Heather has her hand up. Go ahead, Heather.
All right, let's get into round two here. We haven't talked about China. And why I want to talk about China is because I happen to think personally, it's not that big of a player in the Arctic, doesn't have that much capability, hasn't done a lot of foreign direct investment, and we've overstated a lot of that. But it is a great example of, are we going to do with China what we did with Russia the last 15 years? And Ryan, you had a great summary, hilarious summary of the book. But you said the word, I think, the North Arctic, strategic triangle environment, but you forgot to use the acronym NASTY. That's the best part of the whole thing, is that Rob calls it nasty. So we have a new nasty situation in the Arctic. So that's what I want to get back to you to. based on what you've done and the lessons you've learned, how are you going to talk about China and the Arctic going forward?
Great question.
Yeah, I'm happy to take a cut at that, Heather. First of all, so your first part, mine would be, we are wrong to assign China peer competitor status in the Arctic. This is something that's become now almost an embedded assumption in the literature. This is playing, first of all, right into Beijing's hands, which is seeking to legitimize and amplify their profile, because this is about prestige in my mind as much as anything else. We should refer to them as a competitor, because I see this competitive space, not just in the economic sector, but as part of more generalized competition, which is a natural state of affairs. The challenge is we have got too hot. We identified China as something new, so we could justify saying we need new analytics to understand Arctic patterns of interactions in the international sphere. People like Rob were right on there with China right away. They fit within a replacement after the Ilulissat Declaration. For those of you who know, right, kind of said the Arctic states are going to collaborate in a peaceful way, legal law-abiding way, to sort out things like extended continental shelf limits and outstanding disputes. China, as this new rogue element, gave Rob something to pivot around to and say, oh good, there's still threats, they're a disturbing element. My epiphany moment was being over in China for the second Sino-Canadian exchange with Rob, and us cracking open hearing the briefs from our Chinese colleagues, talking to us about, oh, the Arctic has risk of conflict. And Rob's like, see, I told you that's what the Chinese are thinking. We cracked open the book they gave us, and all the footnotes were in English referring to Rob's writings. They were echoing back to Rob what he had told them, and he was using that as a smoking gun to say, see, China expects conflict in the Arctic is now a military problem. It's not to negate the fact that China is a competitor. And I said before, mea culpa, I think the book that I wrote with some colleagues a few years ago, we did not include a chapter on the military that we originally had in, because we said that's not the primary focus of what the Chinese competition is going to look like. We saw that book as an opportunity to almost suggest, if China is going to come and play in a sustained way in the Canadian Arctic or in the Arctic more generally, here are the rules. I think why I've changed my tune is what we've seen with the Michaels, what we've seen in terms of coercive diplomacy, what we've seen in terms of patterns elsewhere. I don't think I can any longer think that there is going to be a respect for that rules-based order that, to me, is an essential precondition to any kind of sustaining it. It doesn't mean that we will not partner or can't partner with individual Chinese scientists. It doesn't mean then that we need to paint China as some existential threat. I think Ryan and I have done some exploring of alternate ways of looking at China. Rather than looking at it as a major disruptor, it might try to really play by the rules in the Arctic region as it mapped out in its white paper, because that would be a way of pointing, as they're doing elsewhere, to say, hey, you can't tell us Arctic states that we're misbehaving. Look at how well we're playing our scripted role in the Arctic Council. It might be that they're going to use this as a diversionary theater. Why I put that all out there is it also relates to Adam, I think, your question in the chat about intelligence figuring in. And I say, yes, intelligence figures in. No, I'm not privy to anything in the classified domain, so it's only open source stuff. But my big question is, what of the generalized insights or intelligence assessments of actors like China? A, require unique or exceptional Arctic action on the part of states like Canada or different actors. So what is extraordinary about the Arctic? And then secondly, do the metrics that we use to discern threat, right, as capability plus intent. Rob, coming from sort of a realist standpoint, you'd say he probably puts more weighting on capabilities. I, coming from, as Ryan said, that constructivist history background, maybe a little bit more emphasis on intent. But when we look at that whole interplay, I think that's very much where the discussion, still remains to be fleshed out, is when you're dealing with an autocratic regime like China in particular. You are dealing with a black box actor where we don't get to see within. There's not the transparency that we have in our parliamentary democracies in Canada or other democratic things. We're inferring a lot, and I think we have gotten in a danger that we're trapped by our own preconceived notions and assumptions, and that we're now doing circular logic where we're just reinforcing our own assumptions too often. And we need to also invite many of you who are out there, some brilliant minds entering into this who actually aren't encumbered by the baggage of having explored this for decades like Rob and I, to come in and actually question whether some of our assumptions, without saying that we're inherently wrong. You don't need to say that we're inherently wrong. You just need to say, what about if we think about it like this? And how does that change the way we anticipate or how we frame or how much weight we give to an actor like China, who I say are very influential in the debate, but don't have a lot of power in an Arctic space. But we attribute them or ascribe them a whole bunch of power that actually doesn't exist. And in essence, we also send very, I think, problematic strategic messages out there by elevating China and downplaying ourselves.
Of course, just to add to that, I mean, going back, as Whitney has said, we were part of this dialogue with the Chinese where they'd come over, we'd come over, very much at the creation of a good friend, colleague, Aldo Cherkov back at Dalhousie University. One other thing, of course, that caught our attention is that when the People's Research Institute of China, and I won't ask you to think what that abbreviation spells out, but in that particular context, that we have the situation that the first social science department that they added was a Department of Strategic Studies. And so, you know, footnotes, whatever, that was an important issue. And it was a very intriguing issue, as both Suzanne and Whitney will remember, is that the head of the Chinese delegation that was hosting us, who had also done his JSD with Aldo and when I was doing my PhD. And I never noticed it at first, but towards it, it became apparent that whenever I was talking, he left the room. And I teased him one time because I thought I was on a good enough basis after we had a couple of glasses of wine. I said, Gal, I'm going to take it personal. Every time I talk, you're leaving. He says, I have to. And, it was sort of like, that was all I could get out of him. And every other time it was on a really good interpersonal. When that happened to me, to be perfectly honest, so they're amplifying some of the points that Whitney is saying about an authoritative, different type of state. That's the first time, it flabbergasted me that I was dealing, because you could sit and drink, like Suzanne was saying, we could be in Denmark and have that. And if the guy had sat around, I would have had a beer with him afterwards and chatted with him. And our entire experience, I think, within our group from an international perspective, is that even in the Russian conferences, you still were able to sit and have a chat with whoever, what's his name up in Sergey up in St. Petersburg. You can disagree with him strongly and still get it. But the idea that here was a person that did his PhD, same time as me, really smart guy, nice guy, and he can't sit with me. And it was there like, okay, there is something different. I don't know quite what it is. Now, getting to the heart of Heather's, very astute question here, the challenge for me is how do I think of China, which is now becoming the second major hegemon in the international system, has expansionary moves, all the points for what Whitney has said in terms of the two Chinas, Taiwan, the restoration of all the ills they feel were bestowed upon them in the century of humiliation. And they're picking and choosing when to come into the Arctic. And because all of us have been trained that if we're going to focus on the Arctic, all these actors, their full attention is on the Arctic. Suzanne is the only one that ever reminds us all the time that, hey, you got to think about something like the law of the sea and how it then influences the law of the sea, the Arctic dialogues at times. But for most of us, and I know I'm guilty of this, is they're like, well, Canada's Arctic, Russia's Arctic, United States is Alaskan Arctic, but they're Arctic. And so all of a sudden we have this country that is authoritative, has a different academic system, has a different set of relationships, and it picks and chooses when it comes in. And so do you go holus bolus and say, okay, they're a peer competitor, big threat, like we would think of the Soviets/Russians, or do we have to start conceptualizing it as something different? And this is something I'm still wrestling with, because I'm trying to figure out, okay, well, how do we factor that in? Yeah, China is getting ready for retaking Taiwan, is already retaken Hong Kong, but it's going to try and keep us off balance in the Arctic. And how do we think about that? And so all of that is something, Heather, it's a brilliant question, and I haven't figured out how to do it yet.
Okay, thanks, Rob. Yeah, the question of China, some of the responses to it kind of line up a bit with some of the questions we've had posed to us in the chat here in the Q&A about, we have these debates about Arctic security in Canada, Canadian sovereignty, security in Canada. To what extent are we factoring in what some of the debates about Arctic security might be in some of these other Arctic nations, Russia in particular, but even though a lesser player to China. I'm wondering if, I'm just looking at the time, so we have about 10 more minutes before we have to start wrapping up. There was a great question in the chat here posed by Andrea, if I may go to this, about the extent to which there might be a generational component to the way we think about the Arctic, or to some of the arguments in the Arctic. And I wonder if that's worth reflecting on. I think it is worth reflecting on. And I'm wondering if, and Ryan, I don't want to put you on the spot here entirely. And I tend to like to dispense with notions of junior and senior scholars. We're all in this together. But as someone who's about to become maybe, a voice of the next sort of wave of scholars writing about the Arctic, I'm wondering, and I won't put you on the spot, by the way, Ryan, but wondering what folks think about, so this book captures what the debates about Arctic security have been in the past 10 years. And I'm wondering if the panel would want to consider, keeping that generational piece in mind, what should the debates be going into the future, or what are we likely to see or maybe debate is the wrong, maybe I'm too much of a political scientist, maybe it doesn't have to be a battle, right? But just wondering what should the priorities be, maybe that's a better way to put it, be going forward when we talk about Arctic security. And I don't know who would like to, if anyone would. Oh, Heather, there you are. I see you. Go ahead.
Well, I don't want to take up too much time, but I had a similar question. So glad that this person asked it. But here we have this great Arctic Canadian brain trust. There's some heavy hitters here. And you have to ask yourself, what are we trying to accomplish? What have we accomplished? And what are we trying to accomplish? Is this just an exercise and we get to have a good time and hopefully in a year have wine after? Or what are the policy impacts that we're trying to have? What is the direction that we want it to go in? And are we just describing best case scenarios, worst case scenarios? And do you think we've had impact? What is the impact that you think these discussions have had in the last 15 years? And where do we want to see it go, in the next 15, I guess?
Great. That's a much better way to put it. Thank you, Heather. So who would like to tackle that? Whitney?
I think, Heather, that's brilliant. I mean, one of the suggestions I would suggest is, first of all, Andrea, I love your question. Rob has often in the past suggested that if he did not exist, my career would have looked very different and I would have been the Rob Huebert. So in essence, if I had seen no one dealing with strategic issues in the Arctic or the military sector, so I would have probably dealt with it a little differently than Rob, but I would have found myself going towards that. After all, I met Rob through the Center for Military and Strategic Studies at the University of Calgary. That was what a lot of my research was early in my career. And ironically, through the debate with Rob, I found myself broadening. So rather than getting narrower as I've become more focused on Arctic issues, our discussions have forced me to become more internationalized in the literatures that I'm engaging and the variables that I'm building in. So where I would suggest in answering the question of what am I trying to accomplish as it stands 2022, I've become obsessed with this through to in categorization. And the so what for that is to suggest, let's be more precise about what is being targeted, the nature of the threat itself, so a more formal threat assessment piece. But ultimately, from a policy standpoint, to suggest within those different baskets of threats to the Arctic, who are the key stakeholders, rights holders, people claiming the legitimacy? We can use governmentality literature if we want to look at nature of governance versus techniques or technologies used to implement them. Who needs threats to the Arctic, targeting the Arctic, which don't typically I see reside within the military sector? Who needs to be at the table? And then threats within the Arctic, who needs to be at the table, but who needs to be leading? I think that's actually going to help us to refine a conversation of where are Northerners at the forefront of not only determining priorities and identifying threats, but actually charting the pathway forward. And where, and I'm talking to through threats, might Northerners, stretched with capacity and maybe not having the resident subject matter expertise on how to deal with hyperglide weapons, for example, say, we're fine to have the state represent us at those tables, but make sure that we are represented, at the threats to the Arctic, particularly in certain sectors, and threats in the Arctic. So to me, not just lumping and having these generalized discussions about sovereignty or security with everything that's sort of dealing with that nether region between international relations and domestic politics has absolute requirements if we're going to see this Arctic and Northern policy framework, and particularly the co-development and co-implementation of that framework, if that's going to also be attuned and reflective of dramatic changes going on in terms of Inuit and Nunangat and revisualizations of jurisdictions within Canada, if all of that is going to be synchronized, we need to be much more refined than I would argue we were for 10 years. But then if we're looking at the nature of those international threats, to really be more precise, are we talking about general global threats with an Arctic nexus, or which are dealt with potentially by the experts who deal with international global threats? Or are these things that we really should be bringing this constellation of Arctic expertise to go and put our minds into? To me, those are fundamental if we're going to map out a realistic agenda that's actually able to be implemented in the next decade, because that clarity is going to be essential to also figure out boring stuff like who is the Office of Primary Responsibility, what other actors need to be mobilized around the cabinet table to support this, and then never mind how do we synchronize this with a bunch of civilian lines of effort for strategic investments in transportation, broadband, and then we can go on from there.
I guess what I'd say for the generational, and Andrea, of course, you always ask such good questions. My challenge is I'm always operating with younger generations. I mean, I was always taught that was what you do. And I think in terms, just, Ryan's on the panel here, Will's young guy, Heather's young in my view. But we also look at who's participating, the Robert Cliftons, Gabriel. There's a whole slew of other names of young people that, fortunately are also being fired up by this subject. And so basically, hopefully by the pedagogical approaches, I think that the vast majority of us have accepted, that is that it doesn't matter how old you are, that all that really matters is how good is your idea. That openness to that really has addressed the generational issue. Once again, maybe that's a conceit on my part. But I do think that the generational, and once again, I look at Natson and I look at the young scholars that are being attracted to there, and I'm saying, okay, we're in good shape. We're attracting those people. I mean, I look at some of the other networks, they're not attracting young people in the same degree that I think that Natson is successfully doing. And so I think the generational questions, and it's up to these individuals, as long as they're getting that we're teaching them, yeah, bring your ideas. We don't care who you are, what you are, how old you are, how young you are, if you, whatever. Bring the idea, bring your game, and we want to listen to you. And I don't think that we've done a bad job on that. And I think that is the key to the generational issue. I'd also like to add on the policy side. I think this community, once again, I do bemoan the fact that we haven't figured out how to integrate ourselves as the greater intellectual communities. I think that is a shortfall. The Canada Amongst Nations, that's going to be one of the first Arctic ones that they've had in a very long time, to be perfect. I got to think that the last one they had was Terry Fenge, had a couple of articles in there. And I mean, when you think about the time period, we're not included in those discussions, and it pisses me off. And I take blame for that, for not, being the advocate more than, I know Andrea's done her part, and, now I'm glad to hear Carrie's doing the part, but I do think that we have to do it. On the other side, one of the things that I brought, I think, to the discussions, and I'm so happy to see that the way that Whitney has taken it excellent, way beyond anything that I've done, is that my supervisor, once again, Elizabeth Mann Borghese, said, hey, there's no point in doing academic discourse and understanding unless you're influencing policy making. You need to know how to, basically shirk has all that BS in terms of, oh yes, we're going to go from ideas to action. Yeah, like they're ever going to do that if it doesn't fit within their normative viewpoints. But anyway, I'm ranting there. But the reality is that she believed that and she did it. It was sort of like, no, we're going to get, we're going to study what the law of the sea is, but we're also going to get Canada to get off its ass and ratify the convention. We're going to go out and make sure that the developing countries can come in so that it's not just talk. And that was something that was embedded on me. It was a sort of like, there was no difference. Yeah, you got to talk about what law of the sea means. You got to understand the continental shelf and all the concepts that come with that. But you got to understand how then you got to go talk to people and how you actually got to give it meaningfulness. And that's something that just was inherent. And I watched Whitney in terms of his ease of working between policymakers and the intellectual side. I see the policy, Suzanne is a little bit more reserved on that, but I mean, the reality is the policymakers seek her out. I look at this amazing ability that the pedestal that internal people on the economics are turning to Heather now in terms of, okay, tell us about how to do economic sides on this correctly. So I like to think that within this community again, there is a clear understanding that it's just not theory, it's not just talk, it's actually how do you put a thought to idea to action. And in that context, I look at the creation of the Arctic Security Working Group. I look at all the Arctic policies that come out, and I see all sorts of, you want to understand where Canada's position in regards to marine protected zones are, go read some of Suzanne's writings on terms of what theoretically that means. You want to understand where some of these interface between security and environment on the Canadian policy, go read some of Will's stuff. And so we're seeing this, and I think that is an important contribution that, we see hints of it. When somebody like a Graham Allison retires, go read his introduction, and he's talking about, it's the academic community that really informed where I was going on the foreign policy side of things on the Arctic. And so I think that we have a much greater influence on that than I can think of many other, most other intellectual communities. So, and that's good. And the one thing that wasn't asked is there is also a very strong influence of this grouping in terms of media in Canada. Who does the Murray Brewsters? Who does the Lee Bethunians? Who did, the reporters that understand it? Who do they come to? And once again, that shapes the overall narrative on how the world. So, I mean, on that part, I think we're pretty good. In terms of having other academics pay the proper attention to us, no. That's where I see the big weakness.
Carrie, can I just follow up real quick? Rob's getting my juices flowing too. And to answer quickly Bill Featherstone's question and Susan's questions to bridge it over. First of all, I think if we're looking at maritime security and sovereignty, I think the burning question that I have these days is not thinking it as much as threats to Canada. So that's where I'm different than Rob. But within this space, what are creative mechanisms, or as Suzanne said, as we're broadening our definitions of sovereignty, as we are imagining new ways of governing Canada, as we're thinking about distributions of jurisdiction, and that's being invented and reimagined. Again, referring back to Nutin Obed and the Inuit regional organizations and Inuit Nunangat and these other projects, that to me is where the cutting questions are, the pressing questions are right now in terms of imagining how we're going to exercise jurisdiction and who is exercising jurisdiction on behalf of Canada. And I say that as a Canadian to say, who is the most appropriate Canadian fellow citizen who's going to do this? And I think there's a lot of room for some important exploration work there. And then Susan, pursuant to your excellent question about Russia's involvement in the Arctic, I think the other, moving forward and bridging it to the final question, the anonymous attendee on methodology, is now coming to a point where this debate has been around for a while. There are going to be lots of newcomers who come in and just write their general sweeping piece. I get blasted with one or two of them every single day. Right. But I think for those of us who are in this for the long term and serious, to be more explicit about our methodologies, about our assumptions, and to look at countries like Russia and to say, before we jump ahead and start to categorically suggest that Russia is a risk or a threat in the Arctic, go and ask the questions, what are legitimate Russian interests? Are we looking at this as a work of empathy and understanding first and foremost? How do you think a Russian would approach this question? What are they articulating that are legitimate and favorable or compatible interests with Canada's, ones that are legitimate but incompatible or unfavorable? And then what basket of risks are outright illegitimate and might we seek to delegitimize through our discursive responses or whatever else? To me, there's a lot still of room for precision, for people coming into these questions and asking very deliberate, very specific questions and doing the fine-grained work of actually parsing how we can best deal with this competitive space. And it requires now, I think, a greater degree of precision than some of those earlier conversations where we were very much doing it in an ideas generation context. I think now it's much more, I love to use the phrase fidelity, like much more clarity and then thinking very precisely too about what the implications are of our messaging. And I think that speaks to, Heather, your wonderful question, which I think would have been a great one to leave us all thinking is, what direction do we want to go in? That there is a creative part to what we're doing as academics and the way that we are actually conducting the debates and what we're choosing to play, during our orchestra, when we orchestrate these kind of events, and asking what are we really trying to build towards.
Great, thank you, Whitney. So it appears as though we have gone slightly over time, but I have been asked by Shannon to wrap it up, and by way of wrap up, to ask each of the panelists if you have any concluding, very quick, let's say 30 to 60 second wrap up thoughts, and we'll end with Rob. So we're going to give you the last word as the mentor in chief in this group here today. So Ryan, can we put you on the spot and begin with you? Are you comfortable with that? And we'll just go around.
Yeah, sure. Something that always struck me is Rob is this grizzled old veteran of not just one, but two academic debates in the Arctic. And what strikes me as odd is his debate with Griffiths was great, but it was polarizing. And his debate with Whitney very much filled in that middle ground. It went the other way. And that's just something that always struck me very much when I look at them in the larger literature. So thank you.
Thanks, Ryan. Will, do you like to say anything to wrap up?
Just to once again express my thanks to everybody who participated, including most particularly Rob and Whitney. I look forward to future Fetchrift projects on both of your work. I guess you're entering that stage of career, so looking forward to being a part of it. But what I would like to say is that I think although we may not have to convince lay people or other scholars about the relevance of the Arctic in the same way, I think it still really falls to those of us who kind of identify as Arctic scholars and those of us who are active in this space to play an active role in trying to shape these debates and trying to influence these debates to reflect our understandings and our expertise. And I know that you've both done that, and I think that's a really important public-facing role that I think requires leadership and requires intellectual and academic leadership. So thanks to both of you for providing it.
Thank you, Will. Suzanne, do you have a last word for us?
I just wanted to say, I think what we've all heard from all of us is the richness of being able to go maybe outside our little boxes, just ideas. And so I think being able to interact with colleagues from other disciplines, it's just it brings strength to our own understandings, even like my legal understandings. And I just wanted to add how much this community includes so many of the people in the participants lists. And if I wasn't explicit about that there's so many other people who have been so incredibly inspiring. So, and thank you to you, Carrie, for managing this session so well for us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Suzanne. Heather?
Yeah, a pleasure to be part of this. We've been talking about Arctic security for 20 years, and sometimes we talk about it in the same way. And if I have to hear about the sovereignty of the Northwest Passage one more time, I do something dramatic. I don't want to say I'm going to shoot myself. That's too dramatic, but you guys know what I'm saying. So, I'm looking forward to that next generation coming up and for some of the dynamics to change, or to recognize that some of the assumptions and dynamics have changed, and to continue to evolve that work and to continue to direct policy in a good way and keep it a region of low tension.
Great, thank you. Whitney, any last words, and then we'll go to Rob.
No, my final word is thank you. I really feel throughout my career that I've been incredibly blessed to be surrounded by brilliant people who, have led me to be, I think much more or constantly rejuvenated in terms of ideas and re-energized in terms of my commitment to just seeking out deeper understandings, better understandings. I think we can sometimes forget that as academics, our job is to not necessarily be definitive. That's not the purpose here, to have the last word on something. If we have the last word, then the debate dies. In fact, it's great to be using every event, as I think Rob and I have tried to do, to basically prime the next debate. And in a lot of our public interactions, speaking ones, Rob and I have often confessed afterwards, we'll each put in a point or something that we weren't expecting for one another, and we'll be waiting with anticipation for that next debate when we get together and we can counter that argument that's been raised or that real point that sort of undermines something or exposed attention. And I really, again, grateful to everybody on the panel, people who contributed questions here for, again, contributing that spirit, and want to say at the end of the day, I do feel every day like I do have the best job in the world, and that as academics, I hope we continue to make modest but honest contributions to public discourse at a time when I think that is becoming increasingly constrained, and that honesty, forthrightness, and inclusivity remain very, very important. And I just feel so blessed, so fortunate to have such a wonderful group of inspiring colleagues, mentors, and indeed friends to share my academic life with.
Well, let me just echo so much and just say thank you to the organizers, and thank you to the panelists and to the participants in the list. I mean, this is what fires me up. I'll be perfectly honest. When Whitney came up with the idea of this, I had reservations, and it was just sort of like, what's the point of that? That seems kind of egotistical. I mean, why do it? And then after having this type of discussion and the reflections that it causes to think about the broader ideas, the broader community, I'm so glad that Whitney didn't listen to my negativity. And as Whitney always does, once he comes up with an idea, it's like, a bone from a dog. You're not going to get it away. And so the reality is that I think it's great because it goes so much broader than what, the book hopefully gives you some good ideas, a substance in and of itself. But I think the greater picture that it poses and what it says about the community, I think that is the secondary important aspect in this type of discussion in my mind, is what basically really, really undermines that. Wow, what a good idea. And I'm looking forward to the next set, as Will, Heather, and Susan and Ryan are saying, wow, let's see what's going to happen next. Anyway, so thank you very much.
Okay, well, what a great discussion of Arctic security and how we think about Arctic security. I'm thrilled to have been a small part of it. Thank you to all of our panelists and organizers. Thank you to all of our attendees. Some great questions. And Shannon, I will turn it back over to you.
Great, thank you so much. And just to echo Carrie's thoughts, I don't think I've ever laughed, smiled, and nodded in deep appreciation and respect so much as just being behind that black screen there. So thank you very much. Thank you, Carrie, for your expert moderating. You played a big part in today, not a small part. Rob, Whitney, Heather, Suzanne, Will, Ryan, for sharing all of your insights. And also I feel honored to work with all of you in NADSN and so many of our members and students who are online with us today. So thank you very much. And I'd also like to thank Mr. Troy Bouffard, our another NADSN coordinator, and he's as well the director of the Center for Arctic Security and Resilience at the University of Fairbanks, Alaska, for their great support in helping facilitate this webinar today. And thank you so much to our audience. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for your participation and your engagement. And just before you head out the door here, our virtual door, I'd like to promote our event next week featuring our very own Dr. Rob Huebert, as well as Dr. Katerina Zisk, and they will be speaking about Russian Arctic militarization. And this will be next week on Thursday at 12 p.m. Eastern. So we would welcome you to join us in that event. And I will just pop our registration link in the chat here for you to find. So thank you all very much for joining us today. What a great discussion. And we look forward to seeing you at a future event. So thank you so much and take care.